Carl Jung noticed something remarkable while studying the personal notes and private writings of the old alchemists, something that went well beyond the ordinary picture of a scientist calmly and objectively observing a chemical experiment from a safe emotional distance. Many of these old workers described their laboratory labor in language that made no sense at all if you assumed they were simply heating minerals in a furnace the way a modern chemist might. They wrote about their own inner suffering as though it were somehow identical to the physical process happening in their glass vessel. When they described their raw material being subjected to intense heat and painful purification, they described themselves undergoing the very same fiery torment at the very same moment, not as a metaphor or a poetic flourish, but as something they experienced as genuinely and inseparably real. One old physician and alchemist put this connection with striking directness. He explained that while the worker heats his chemical substance in the furnace, he himself is simultaneously and morally undergoing that same fiery torment and purification. By projecting himself so completely into the substance he was working with, he had become, in his own words, unconsciously identical with it, genuinely suffering the very same process the material itself was undergoing in the flames. This was not, in his understanding, some optional emotional overlay added on to an otherwise purely physical and objective procedure. It was, he insisted, simply what actually happened whenever a person engaged seriously and completely with the work of real transformation. The worker and the work became, in some genuine and inescapable sense, one and the same fire. Jung took this observation seriously as more than historical curiosity, because he recognized in it a pattern he had watched play out again and again in his own clinical practice and indeed in his own personal experience as a working psychologist. He came to believe that this old alchemical insight pointed towards something genuinely true and genuinely important about any real process of transformation, whether the substance being transformed was a mineral in a furnace or a troubled pattern in a human psyche. You cannot, according to this old understanding, remain a purely detached, unaffected observer while genuinely engaging with the real transformation. Something in the person doing the work inevitably becomes involved, tested, and changed by the very process they're attempting to bring about in whatever they are working with. This mattered enormously for how Jung understood his own role as a therapist working with genuinely troubled patients, and it set him apart from many of his contemporaries who preferred to imagine the ideal therapist as a purely objective, emotionally uninvolved scientific observer diagnosing and treating a patient's condition from a position of complete personal safety and distance. Jung came to believe this model was not simply incomplete, but actually mistaken about how genuine psychological transformation actually worked. A therapist who remained entirely unpacked, entirely safe from the fire that a patient was genuinely suffering through, was, in Jung's understanding, unlikely to be capable of helping that patient undergo any truly deep transformation at all, precisely because real transformation, according to the old alchemical wisdom, required the worker to be genuinely involved in the same fire as the substance being worked. This does not mean, and Jung was careful never to suggest, that a helper should simply lose themselves entirely in another person's suffering, becoming so completely fused and overwhelmed that they could no longer offer any useful perspective or guidance at all. The old alchemists themselves understood the danger of this complete and undisciplined fusion, and much of their careful, patient technique was designed precisely to manage the intensity of this connection, allowing genuine involvement without complete and destructive dissolution. But they were equally clear that some degree of genuine personal involvement, some willingness to actually be affected and changed by the work rather than remaining permanently safe and untouched, was simply an unavoidable and necessary part of any real transformation, not an unfortunate risk to be entirely eliminated through professional detachment. This principle extends well beyond the specific context of formal therapeutic work, and it offers something genuinely important for anyone attempting to help another person, or indeed anyone attempting any genuine act of creation or transformation in their own life. Consider what actually happens when you try to help someone through a genuine crisis while keeping yourself entirely safe, entirely unaffected, entirely detached from what they are actually going through. There is very often something the other person can sense in this kind of help, a quality of distance that, however well-intentioned, communicates that you are not actually willing to enter the fire alongside them, only to offer instructions from a safe position outside it. And there is very often, correspondingly, something genuinely different and genuinely more helpful about support that comes from someone willing to be actually moved, actually affected, actually changed in some small way by their genuine engagement with what another person is suffering through. The same principle applies with equal force to any genuine act of creation, whether writing, art, building something new, or working through a difficult problem of your own. The old alchemical insight suggests that you cannot produce work of real depth and real transformative power while remaining entirely untouched and unaffected by the process of making it. Something of yourself has to actually enter the fire alongside the material you are working with, and this is precisely why genuine creative or transformative work so often leaves the person who made it changed in ways they did not fully anticipate when they began. The worker who remains entirely safe, entirely unaffected, entirely outside the fire, tends to produce work that mirrors the same safe distance, technically competent perhaps, but lacking the genuine depth that only comes from real personal involvement in the transformation itself. There is a genuine cost to this kind of engagement, and the old alchemists were honest about it, describing their own labor in terms of real suffering, real torment, real personal risk. Jung never suggested that this cost should be sought out recklessly or without wisdom, and he was clear that some degree of protective boundary remained necessary, both for a therapist working with patients and for anyone engaged in genuinely demanding creative or transformative work. But he insisted that the attempt to eliminate this cost entirely, to remain permanently safe and untouched, while still expecting to produce genuine transformation either in another person or in your own life, was simply a misunderstanding of how real transformation actually works. The fire, according to this old and hard-won wisdom, is never optional for the person who genuinely wants to change something. It is simply the price, honestly paid, of engaging with the work at all. Think honestly about an area of your own life where you have been attempting some kind of genuine transformation, whether helping someone else through a difficult time, creating something that genuinely matters to you, or working through a real change in your own patterns while trying to remain entirely safe, entirely unaffected, entirely unaffected, entirely outside the fire of what that transformation actually requires. Consider what might shift if you allowed yourself to be genuinely, if carefully, involved in the same process you are hoping to bring about. If you can identify a place in your own life where genuine transformation seems to require you to be actually changed by the process rather than remaining safely outside it, write below the single word for what that fire would actually cost you. Naming it honestly is often the first step toward the kind of real engagement the old alchemists insisted no genuine transformation could ever happen without. Because the old workers bent over their furnaces through countless difficult nights were never simply describing a chemical process when they spoke of their own suffering alongside their material. They were describing, in the only language available to them, one of the oldest and most demanding truths the human soul has ever discovered, that nothing is ever truly transformed by a hand that refuses to enter the same fire.